My name's Andrew Sears. I'm currently the executive director of a Christian nonprofit organization called Tech Mission. But my interest in social class, I feel like comes more from my own personal journey. So I thought I'd start off telling you a little of my own story and kind of how I got involved in thinking about reconciliation across class. So my own story is, no one really grows up thinking that they're poor. You don't, as a kid, say, oh, we're poor, But I lived in inner city Kansas City, in the neighborhood that I lived in, and whenever I was first growing up, according to my brothers, and I wasn't even very aware of this at the time, but it was dangerous enough that the police were afraid to go to. And I remember the kids across the street, it was largely a poor white neighborhood. The kids across the street would be playing out in the street naked. They're 7 to 8 years old. It was just kind of because they just didn't know any better, and that was kind of the environment. And that was a pretty crazy place, and I could tell you a lot of stories about bad things that happened there, but I'm not going to do that during this time. But I moved to another neighborhood that was a little bit better. It was kind of a racially mixed neighborhood, but it was still primarily white, but it was culturally black. So for those of you who are familiar with Eminem, the rapper, just imagine like kind of a whole neighborhood with a bunch of little kind of Eminem type kids, So and that was us in our neighborhood, and it was a pretty crazy place where I remember in second grade I felt like I was out of place in my neighborhood because I hadn't had sex and I hadn't done drugs in my neighborhood, and I felt like I'm behind the times or whatever, I guess. And I didn't realize that wasn't normal, I guess, in the rest of the country. It was just the way life was where I lived. And a lot of different neighborhoods, they will have, that are living in poverty, they'll have different issues or different experiences of group trauma of, sometimes, the neighborhood, it'll be violence or gangs, or sometimes it'll be drugs. I would say sex was the most dangerous thing about the neighborhood, where I didn't find this out until as an adult, but almost everyone I knew was sexually abused and became sexually active at a very young age. And that affected us, how we grew up. The other thing about our neighborhood was most of the kids had to kind of start functioning as adults at a very young age, including myself, and we lived our lives making decisions like adults. We woke up in the morning and we decided, what are we going to do today? And our options were, do we play Atari, do we watch TV, do we go do vandalism, do we go shoplifting, do we steal bikes, or what do we do? And it was kind of this crazy environment where it was just the ideas like playing Atari, was back in the early 80s, were kind of morally equivalent to us to going shoplifting, and some days you'd be like, I don't know, Atari's getting boring, let's go shoplifting or something. And it was because we didn't have any adults in our lives that we really could trust, and there was so much kind of craziness that was going on in our environment. I spent most of my time out on the streets with my friends. I did have a Christian background. That's kind of what is a little interesting also about my story. My father, he was a minister in a black storefront church. It was in one of the most dangerous parts of the city, a part of the city that was so dangerous that they actually robbed the church during a service at one point, and at that point they realized that they couldn't have weekday services anymore. They could only have services on Sundays. And I grew up going to black churches. I grew up going to white churches. But I also, part of my life was living in this chaotic urban jungle thing. And the other part, because my parents were very Christian, they came up with just enough money to send me to a Christian school. So living in the Midwest, I went to a very right-wing Christian school. And what it did provide me was a decent education. But I kind of lived this crazy world where part of my world was kind of this concrete jungle, just living, doing whatever you want, kind of like if those of you seen the movie Lord of the Flies, it was kind of a little bit like that, but an urban version of that. And then the other part, let me put this up. The other part was, is that better? Okay. The other part was living in this almost militaristic type of Christian school environment. So I kind of lived these dual lives. And I remember at the Christian school where I was at, there's all this craziness going on in my life, in my home life, and there's abuse in the neighborhood. But what was hard for me to understand is that I didn't fit in there. One, because there was all these middle class and upper class kids, and I was kind of a thug, and I had to pretend like I wasn't. And but the other thing that was hard for me is there's all this abuse that was going on in my life. So the thing they were most concerned about at the time was how long my hair was and all these other things, and no one was really concerned about what were the reasons why I was kind of rebellious there. So I kind of went from there and went into high school. In high school, I became more openly rebellious, being the son of a preacher. There's kind of the whole preacher's kid syndrome that hits, and in elementary school I was doing these things, and my parents had no idea that I was living kind of this other life. I was just out on the street doing this crazy stuff. But in high school I openly rebelled, partied, had a lot of different girlfriends. Whenever I was 17 years old, my girlfriend got pregnant, and that was kind of a wake-up call for me. She ended up having a miscarriage at the time, but I'd come from this kind of legalistic Christian background, and what that did to me is it made me realize that this is what happens whenever you make mistakes. And something in me snapped where I just kind of took on the guilt from that miscarriage and decided I can't make any more mistakes. And I realized that, the phrase that you only get one chance, that often applies to people in the urban environment. I think I had that mentality, even though with grace that definitely isn't true. So I kind of traded in this rebelliousness to kind of being this perfectionist, and I saved up enough money from working at Burger King to make it through my first year at college. And going to college was a big shift for me class-wise, because I'd come from urban community where I talked like I was Eminem or whatever, and I went to college and it was in this rural community, and I had to learn, going to college, I had to learn to talk white because all the other white kids talked like that, and I had to learn to talk the proper way, and I had to learn to dress like everyone else. And it was the end of the 80s, and the poor white kids in the 80s were that was during the whole glam rock era, and I thought that was the coolest thing. And in high school I was really cool because I had the long hair and the ripped up jeans and the mullet, and I had it all. And I went to college, and all of a sudden that stuff wasn't cool anymore, and it was kind of a culture shock. So I had to learn to readjust to the world on that level. And for a large part, I was largely on my own, and I think I had this fear, like I had to do so well just to be able to make it. And I knew that to make it through college, either I was going to have to work or I was going to have to get scholarships. And the scholarship that I was able to get said that I had to get a 3.75 GPA and keep that to stay in school. And I kept thinking, if I don't get a 3.75, I'm going back to work at Burger King. So I studied like mad while I was at school, and basically became a perfectionist, became kind of a workaholic. And let me just went at University of Missouri at Rolla, and studied engineering. And at the time I studied engineering because it was something that I was good at, and you could make money at it. I didn't really know anything else other than that, and I was just that's kind of what I did. And but I basically became a complete overachiever, and I went from being kind of this rebel in high school to being making good grades, student body president, like all these things. And I was an overachiever, but I still didn't really feel like I fit in. And what was happening in my relationship with God at that time, I'd grown up in a Christian home, but I'd kind of been rebellious for a while, but I was really searching, and I spent my summers working in urban ministries. So I would be doing like engineering stuff during the year, and I think there's a part of me that knew there's something about me that was connected with the city, and I got involved in a gospel mission one summer. The next summer I went to South Africa. It was right after apartheid ended, and worked with street children in South Africa with a rescue mission there. And so I kind of had this relationship with God where it was kind of this binge purge relationship with God, where I would have these great encounters with God, and then I would go back to college, and I was used to living this crazy lifestyle, and eventually that lifestyle would come back. So ultimately, all that, I ended up doing well in school, went to graduate school at MIT, and everything caught up to me while I was at MIT, where I had had these aspirations to be like the next Bill Gates or whatever, and I was there at the time. It was right before the dot-com boom. My advisor was one of the chief. He was like one of the fathers of the internet. So I thought I'm going to be the next Bill Gates or whatever. But basically, God just made me hit a brick wall to where I couldn't function at all. I got completely depressed. I think all of kind of the abuse and stuff from my own childhood started coming up, to where my second year there, basically all I could do was sit in bed and cry, and couldn't function in classes. I had to drop all my classes, and I was like, what's going on I'm going from this completely over-functioning to melting down, essentially. And I think what had happened is I had been running from my past all that time. And while I was at MIT, and also through college, I was running into class things fairly often, especially at MIT. Whenever I remember the first time class hit me while I was at MIT. We were all, eating dinner someplace, and people were sharing different stories from their childhood. And I shared a story about how my friends put a couch on the railroad tracks just to see what would happen whenever a train came. And I thought this is a typical story that everyone else, they were going to talk about, yeah, there's that time we put the car on the railroad tracks just to see what happened, but everyone looked at me like I was a terrorist or something. And I realized that, we're not in the hood anymore. And it was kind of a different world. And very quickly I didn't even realize it at the time, but very quickly I became friends with a couple other poor white folks who were in my class, and we all realized that, we joked around that we were the white trash there, and somehow we'd slipped through the whatever filter that they had. And I think there's honestly that feeling there. And I look back on even my own undergrad in high school, even through undergrad and high school, all the people who I made connections with came from low-income backgrounds. And in college, I remember being kind of at a loss because I always connected more with African American students, but I couldn't join the Black Student Union because I wasn't black, so I didn't know what to do, But I never really quite fit in with white people. And essentially what happened is I hit this burnout. I said a prayer to God. God, you either have to help me or kill me because I can't live like this anymore. And God completely revolutionized my life. Long story, went through a lot of counseling, went through a lot of recovery at a church, and really just realized a lot of the stuff that I'd just gone through in the city. It was something that I couldn't just leave behind me. It was following me. I was running from it. I was running faster and faster, and ultimately it caught up with me. And basically went through a lot of healing with God during that period, and started to realize that myself, I had more of a heart for justice. This aspiration to be the next Bill Gates, that was more something that my own brokenness had provided. And I had a heart for justice, so I got involved in urban ministry. I had this tech background, and that's how I got involved in using a Christian computer center. And from there, we started up this Christian computer center that was a part of Bruce Wall Ministries, and we expanded that to this association called AC4. I just did a tech presentation, so it feels like kind of weird going from tech to this all of a sudden. And then we started up this organization, Tech Mission. Some of you have probably seen we're one of the sponsors here at the conference. But in kind of reflecting on a lot of my own background, I've realized, over these past 8 years that so much of my life and my own history, God has made about class reconciliation. I didn't even realize it at the time. Some of the reasons why that's true, one, just coming from where I came from, and then gaining this high access to, all these elite institutions and those things, that made me just deal with class all the time. Another reason why I have to deal with class all the time, I have a friend who, she's an African-American woman. She married a white man, and she said, I'm called to reconciliation for the rest of my life. There's no way to get around it because of her marriage. And the same type of thing is true for me. So I married my wife, Heather. She isn't able to be here right now. But she's an amazing woman. She comes from a very wealthy background. And the class differences, we didn't realize it initially in our marriage. We both look white. We thought, okay, we're a little different. But part of what I've realized is that often the cultural differences across class can be as significant as racial differences. And now we've been married for 5 years and realizing, wow, we're very different people. So, but we're having to work through the process of class reconciliation in our marriage. And the other area where I've been exposed to this is through Tech Mission. Because we're focused on technology, we've been exposed to all these different ministries from around the country, and they all have a different approach to race and class. And we go to the Salvation Army conferences, we go to the Association of Gospel Rescue Mission conferences, we go to all these different groups that often people from the groups don't go to each other's conferences as often. I mean, sometimes people do. But what we've been exposed to all these different ways of thinking about ministry, and I think that's given us kind of a unique perspective on class, and myself a unique perspective on class. So that's a little my own background, but I just wanted to provide that because I feel like that's one of the most important things for you to understand on how I'm approaching class, because a lot of what I'm going to be presenting is a little different take on class than is typically done, and hopefully you can understand where that's coming from. It's coming a lot from my own experiences with that. So, any questions before I get going? I'm going to send out some handouts, and people can pass those around. And also I have some sign-up sheets. Just so part of what I'm hoping to do is to get together a group of people at CCDA who care about class, who have an interest in class, and to start a dialogue about this stuff. Because I feel like in the past 5 or 10 years especially, there's been a new dialogue that's happening about class, and I would love to get some of the leaders in CCDA to participate in that. So I'm going to send around this sign-up sheet, and on there's a little part that says sign up for a newsletter. That's not a newsletter, it's just I want to be on an email list or something that talks about class. So say yes if you want to be on that. So, and I'll send those around. So any questions people have? All right, so, hold on. I have some notes here I need to get. So whenever we talk about the term class, what do people think about? Let me just hear what's the first thing that comes to people's minds whenever you hear the term class or social class? Family background, okay. Economic status. Money, okay. Other people? Education, okay. Does it bring up any negative connotations with people? Separation, yeah. Prejudice, yeah. Any other thoughts people have? What class brings up?
It'll never leave.
It'll never leave. Okay. There's someone else over here. Hidden roles. I think that's really good. Denial. Yeah, denial around class. So hey, these are some good things. And what do people think about on the term reconciliation? What do you guys think about whenever you hear the term reconciliation? Racial reconciliation. Yeah, that's a big thing people think about. So how do we apply some of the things that we think about on racial reconciliation to class? I think that's part of what we're getting at. What are other things people think about on racial reconciliation? What's that? Race, yeah, okay. Grace. Oh, race and grace. Okay. That's good. Bringing people together. Okay. Any other responses? What was that? Bridging the gap. Okay. Okay. Justice. Okay.
It's really difficult.
Really difficult. That's definitely true. Everyone here who's trying to do that can testify that it's really difficult. One of our staff said empty promises. I think that a lot of people of color who've worked on reconciliation often can have that of concern of, are we really going to do the hard work? I think it is something that's really difficult, and I think that that's what I want to do is kind of start a dialogue around class. How do we think about class reconciliation? So to do that, I'm going to try to define some terms. So these are my definitions. It's not. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, a lot of us can get handouts, and we can't get one copy. So I'm wondering if we sign up for the email that
I'll send a copy. Yeah.
You can send it out.
Yeah, I'll send a copy. And I can print out extra copies at the Cyber Cafe upstairs probably if people want to stop by the Cyber Cafe later. So we can have extra copies. So these definitions I'm presenting, these are my definitions. They aren't, like coming from a textbook or whatever, but I feel like they've been, they've come from real experience. This isn't just some sort of academic thing. It's also come, I have read a little bit about social class. A lot of it is from experience, but I've tried to do a little bit of background. Let me focus this a little better for you guys. Can everyone see this? Hopefully. Yeah, same thing that's on there. So class, in the way I'm defining class is a little different than the way it's typically defined. Most people often think of class as a combination of family income, assets, and job type, or education. That's the more typical approach that's taken towards class. There's this thing called social capital. And basically the idea behind social capital is that a community has a certain amount of assets that just kind of are hard to measure. Like if everyone you know goes to college, you can find a lot of people who can help you get into college. Or if you're at a church where everyone has a job and they're in companies where they know of job openings, you can find someone who can provide you with a job. Or a lot of things along those lines. It's the more tangible things. Another thing that I think is a major aspect of social class is level of exposure to group trauma and oppression. And there it could be violence, it could be different forms of abuse, it could be drugs, it could be other things. But often, and it's the group aspect, often there are communities where there's a whole group. Like in my neighborhood, there was violence, there was drugs. I got in tons of fights and everyone was doing drugs. But I would say the biggest trauma that affected us was some of the sexual stuff that happened in our neighborhood. And different neighborhoods will have different types of trauma, or different communities will have that. Culture. A lot of times people don't realize that there's a cultural element to class. So someone who's low income is going to have a different culture from someone who's higher income, or someone who I would say is coming from a lower class background is going to have a different culture from someone coming from a middle or upper class background. Another factor, status level in community and society. Someone could be high status but low income, community leader, or it could be an athlete, or something along those lines. And one of the most important factors I would also say is, what's the class identity? So class isn't just an individual thing, it's also a group thing. So what's the class identity of those around you that you identify with? Are you in a neighborhood that's all lower income? Or do you have a lot of friends that are lower class? And part of what's hard is that class is really hard to define in very concrete terms, and I think that's a part of what I want to emphasize in the definition of class. Is there are some objective measures, but ways you can define class. But I think that part of the problem in the discussion of class is if you only think about it in objective terms and you don't take into account things like social capital, group trauma, culture, and other things, then you're actually losing the majority of the significant aspects of class and classism. So both the objective and subjective parts of class are really important. And it's also important to recognize that people are going to come back from, or are going to come from a lot of different class backgrounds. So someone might come from a lower class family, be in a middle class school, or vice versa, or and just try not to oversimplify class. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to talk about is some of the common misperceptions around class. Some people talked about the term denial. I think that's a pretty good term. There's a lot of people who would like to think that the USA is a classless society. These are the people who define class in terms of, like the European. So there's the lords, and there's the people who have a formal class, and then there's the other people, and they like to think that that's all class is. And since we don't have lords here in the U.S., then we don't have class. But the reality is, most of the studies that have actually looked at class and compared, how much is class a factor in the U.S. compared to Europe? Most of the studies have said that the U.S. actually has more classism, and class is a bigger factor. It's just much more subtle. The difference, though, in the U.S. is that the U.S. is much less class conscious, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But people are less aware of class. So class will be playing a big role in interactions, but it's more on an unconscious level. People may not be as conscious of that. And another, I would say, common misperception, this is a major concern even here at CCDA, is that that somehow by talking about class, it could devalue the discussion around race. And a part of the reason why there's that misconception is right now there's a lot of people who have political agendas, and they're trying to use their political agendas to use class against the race discussion, especially around things around affirmative action. And I think that's kind of crazy to begin with. But I think that really what class does is it enriches the discussion around race and racial reconciliation. That part of what I found is I've learned more and more about class. I've understood a lot of the areas where we get stuck in racial reconciliation really often have to do with class. So I want to talk a little bit about the ways class is typically looked at. And one of the tendencies of any sort of dialogue around race or around class is that the dominant group will define the whole discussion according to their terms. So this is kind of like thinking about the African American studies departments in the 1950s, that it's an all-white faculty explaining to people what it's like to be black. That's not a very effective thing. And not that white people can't, study that, but it's helpful to have kind of an indigenous perspective on things. And I would say that almost the entire discussion around class, I would argue, has been defined in terms of the middle and upper classes. It's been defined in objective terms, which I would say takes away the majority of what I think is important to talk about in class. The objective things are very important, but you also have to look at the subjective things. The other thing is that academic perspective is very compartmentalizing. It will look at things, economics looks at class this way, and then sociology looks at class this way, and no one can really agree on how to discuss it. If you take kind of a set of lower class values, and I'll talk about this later, you wouldn't have those differences. You would value both the objective and the subjective. You wouldn't compartmentalize, and that's a part of what I'm trying to do in how defining class. So does anyone have any questions on that part so far? This next part, is, in sharing this with other people, people have found this to be one of the most helpful things, that understanding what are the parts of class to think about. And there's actually 4 factors that create your class identity. I'd say each of these 4 make up your class identity, and I would encourage people not to overemphasize. As I shared this with our staff, they kept asking, so what is your class background? And I would say, it's this on my what is your class identity? And I would say, it's this on my background, it's this on my consciousness, it's this on access. And I'll just talk a little bit about what each of those are. So class background is what's your class history? And it's a combination of those things that I said that make up class. So family, income, assets, and job type. Education and access to social capital. Level of exposure to group trauma. Class culture. Are you in a culture that is kind of a lower class culture? Or are you immersed in that? Your status level in community and society, and class identity of those around you. So, and your background may be complex. You may have a middle class education, lower family income, and it's important to understand all of those as we think about class access or class reconciliation. Any questions on that people have? Sometimes I talk too quick, so. Okay, so that's class background. One of the most helpful things is to separate out class background from class access. And a lot of times people will confuse all of class as what's your current class access. But class access is what's your current class access to class community. Do you have access to the upper class communities? Do you have access to the lower class communities in terms of relationships? Do you have access to their resources? Do you have access to their power? Based on your income, job type, and assets, education, based on your appearance and speech, based on your access to social capital. And part of what, in looking at each of these, is I would say that there's a godly goal of kind of, what we're trying to do in terms of reconciliation. I'd say the godly goal on access is to increase folks' class access. So we're trying to, this is the redistribution thing. We're trying to increase people's class access. So whenever people ask me my class identity, I say I'm coming from a lower class background, but I have high access now that I've gone through all this education. It makes life really confusing. It, in some ways, is comparable almost to being bicultural or biracial. I can go back home and I can still somewhat fit in back then, but I'm not quite accepted in either world wherever I go. And class consciousness, what that is the ability to perceive, understand, and consciously address. And that consciously address is an important thing. It means that you're taking an active role in addressing systems of classism, your class role culturally. So if you're in a room, you're playing a class role culturally, or if you're in a discussion with someone, you're playing a class role culturally, or in systems. What is our economic systems? It could be political systems. It could be other systems of power within churches. Understanding class as culture, understanding if I'm having this conflict with someone, could that be a cultural class conflict? In racial reconciliation, it's helpful for people to understand, okay, this might be a cultural conflict that we're having across race, and then that helps to begin a dialogue. And the same type of thing can happen across class. And also to be aware of what is your own class identity. You know, a lot of people here are probably familiar with ethnic identity development and things like that. It's not just as simple as knowing, oh, I'm white and I know that I'm white, you know. It's actually understanding what is my role in the world as a white person in addressing injustice and things along those lines. And I would say a godly goal is to increase class consciousness. And class identification, I think this is one of the most important in terms of things that we can affect and choices that we can make personally. And I think this is tying in. It's another way of thinking about CCDA's relocation value. So, but what class identification is, I would say it's primarily the class identity of those closest to you that you identify with. Who are your friends? Who are your community? Who are your family? If you're going to be on someone's side, who are you fighting for? You know what I'm saying? I would say that's a big factor. And who are your friends? Another thing that's really important is allocation of resources towards class groups. So where's your money going? Is your money, and this even could count towards your tithe, is your tithe going to build a, you know, bigger and better steeple to your church, or is your tithe actually going to help a lower income community, or your work? You know, and I appreciate that, you know, everyone has to work to make money to pay the bills and things along those lines. You know, Paul was a tent maker. They're important things, but if your job, you're spending 60 hours a week and you're making, you know, high-end boats for the upper classes, like, I don't know, yachts or something, I would say that there's a significant portion of your class identity that is focused on serving their needs. Now, granted, you could take that money and you could use it somewhere else, and that might affect how you're using things, but where your work's directed towards, I think, is an important part of people's class identity, and how your time's used, your free time. How are you using your free time? Are you using it to meet the needs of upper classes or lower classes? So then another factor is your accessibility to a class group based on your culture, your appearance, your language, and your location. So all those things, you know, there are things that we can do in our churches, there's things that we can do as Christians, become more accessible or less accessible. And it's complicated. What does it mean to be accessible? Because, and I'm not going to get into all the details around that, but the question is, are you accessible to the community? And the other thing is your role in addressing or perpetuating classism. And a part of what's hard about class and classism is so entrenched that we can't live in the world. I mean, the way I would take on classism, you can't live in the world without playing some sort of role in a classist system. So just for example, say you go and you buy something at some store and it was made using forced labor in some other country or exploitative labor. You never know that those, you know, whatever Nikes were being made in Indonesia for 23 cents, you know, an hour. But so many things that are out there, there are systems that are out there. So where we're playing a role in some sort of exploitative process. So it gets to be really hard to sort out what do we do, because it's kind of like, you know, you're in a mud pit and you're trying to stay clean. What do you do in that? And I think a part of what we can do is try to clear out mud pits and things along those lines. But I think that the godly goal is to identify with the lower classes. So do these things, identifying with the lower classes. You can't affect your class background, but you can't affect your class identity. And if you think about the relocation value that CCDA has, I think that this helps enrich that value, because part of what I've seen, I've known a lot of people, they move into the city, but their entire community is still in the suburbs, and their entire community is still upper class. And that, to a certain extent, you need that to survive. You know, if you're going straight in the city and all of a sudden you lose all your old friends and you get a whole new set of friends, you're going to need a certain amount of that to survive. But I think our goal should be to stretch ourselves. And stretch ourselves in a way that's sustainable, because we have to have, you know, sustaining relationships. But at the same time, we're talking about relocating our class identity is essentially what we're getting at with that. So all four of those things make up, just to go back, all four of those things, class background, class access, class consciousness, and class identification, make up class identity. So do people have any questions around how I'm presenting that?
I have a question. I'm wondering how media plays into class identification, as far as, especially with like suburban white people.
Right. Oh yeah, I can talk about that for a long time. I mean, part of what's crazy is, you know, 60% of hip hop music's bought by white people in the suburbs. So whenever they design hip hop music, they're designing it for the white people in the suburbs because that's where more of the money is. And then the end result is, rather than getting basically setting examples that could be helpful in urban communities and things that are addressing issues that are closer to the heart of the urban communities, you're addressing what white people think is cool about urban communities. And I think that perpetuates classism, perpetuates racism. I think that there's a whole range of things. Once you start to get into how media plays a role in materialism, there's a book that I'll reference towards the end called, let's see, Class Matters, Where We Stand, Class Matters by Bell Hooks. Probably the best book on class that's out there. But half of what he talks about is how the media saturates society so it's materialism. And I've seen this within my own family, to where my family members are wrestling with, they have very little income, but there's so much demand to spend and spend and spend, to be overextended, and then get credit card debt and all these other things, which basically you're creating a whole class of people in the U.S. that's basically functioning in indentured servitude. And what's creating that, some of it's credit card companies, but a lot of that is the media pressure that to have any value in society, you have to spend. And I think that, I grew up in inner city neighborhood, and, I remember I had to have Nikes, because if I didn't have Nikes, I got beat up. And there's this, once it gets to that point where you get this materialistic culture, where if you don't spend, you're actually getting beat up, then there's some sort of problem going on in society. And I think that often in urban communities, that's the end result. So, are there other questions? You have a question?
Just want to make sure that questions asked can be repeated for us.
Okay, sorry.
And then secondly, I'm new to us. I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding where we're going here. We're learning about what class identity is,
Right.
And how does that help toward the reconciliation piece?
Well, if you look at Right. So if you think about CCDA, the 3 R's, there's relocation, redistribution, and reconciliation. They're all a part of reconciliation. These tie in with the 3 R's in a lot of ways. So, one is, if you take the redistribution value, it's another way of thinking about redistribution whenever you start thinking about class access. How are we increasing people's access to upper class power resources? So that is addressing reconciliation. The other thing is class consciousness. So class consciousness is the same thing, is another spin on looking at, racial awareness. People talk about, here at CCDA, and if you read the book More Than Equals, talk about having racial blinders. And the idea is that for people who grew up in majority culture, often, it's the idea that I'm colorblind. I see everyone being the same, and that's not helpful so helpful in racial reconciliation. It's actually more helpful to recognize that there are differences and to work through those differences. The same thing's true across class. And then the third area is in identifying. And I'll talk more about some of the aspects of the reconciliation. I think some of it is to recognize, first step in reconciliation is to acknowledge the issues. If all of a sudden we move straight to the forgiveness stage, then I feel like we are giving cheap forgiveness, and that's what my friend said. Whenever I hear the term reconciliation, I think of empty promises, and I think that part of what I'm going to focus a lot on, and I actually presented this to our staff. I had probably 8 hours of materials that I presented to our staff. I had to kind of focus on some of the basics. So there's more to the reconciliation part, but that'll come towards the end. So the book by Bell Hooks is Where We Stand, Class Matters. So she's not a Christian. Well, I don't know. She might be a Christian. I couldn't tell reading the book. I wasn't certain, but it is a really helpful way of thinking about class.
Would you say that racial differences are obviously created by God, but are class differences inherently evil, or are they just neutral?
It depends on what type of class differences you're talking about. So, okay, the question again is, are class differences inherently evil, or are they neutral? There are some that I would say that there's 3 categories, and I have a whole part of another presentation that talks about these. I would say that there's some differences that are actually good, that they're of God. There are some strengths that just like different cultural groups will have different strengths, that those will be good. There's a lot that are just neutral, like my wife and I, one of the big differences that we have is in our taste in movies. So she, this is early in our marriage, she would say, my taste in movies are objectively good because all the critics agreed with her taste in movies because she comes from a middle class background. And I kind of like the, more ghetto movies and stuff. And she's like, those are the not so good movies because the critics don't like those. And that just kind of shows how society, will support certain class values, and that's a part of why, Academy Awards, Denzel Washington took him till, last year before he got an Academy Award and things along those lines. But then there's other things where there's differences that, and most of the differences I would say are not godly. It's evil that's perpetuated in the world. So, the differences on what type of movies me and my wife like, that's a neutral difference. But then there's a lot of differences I'm going to be talking about in terms of classism that are evil. So, one thing I also want to talk about, so in talking about class, the last thing I want to do is to devalue the race discussion. And most of my own background, I grew up in black churches. I came through black churches, and I would be equally glad to have, racial reconciliation presentation. But what I want to do here is focus on the class lens. And part of what's important is to think about what is your primary lens as you look at the world. And different people, I think it's helpful to think about, different people have different lenses. So, one way of thinking about that might be, so, some people have a dominant culture lens, where I would say that is just not seeing oppression because you haven't experienced it on a personal level. Other people might have a racial lens if most of what you've experienced in terms of oppression has been racism, or a class lens if most of the experience that you've had is in terms of classism, or gender lens if most of what you've experienced has been sexism. But the question, some of the questions you might think about in terms of like what lens do I have, and most people actually take a combination of these lenses, so it might be a couple of these. But one thing might be, what's the primary thing that identifies people to you? The other thing might be is if as you walk into a room and you might assess the group power dynamic, what dimensions are you thinking about that? I've had a lot of my black friends, they'll walk into a room, they say they kind of put on their racial radar, and they're like, is this a safe place for me to be black, or do I have to kind of put on my white face or whatever? And I more recently have started to put on, it's almost like this class radar or whatever, where I walk into a room and I got to know what voice do I use. I can't talk like I do with my friends, or I can't talk like I do there. And other people they'll do that in a group dynamic. In our staff, if the men start dominating the discussion all the time, there'll be some women on our staff, they're very conscious of that, and they'll get tired of it, and they have to correct us and things like that. And it all depends on what is our lens in looking at the world. Another way of thinking about that might be if someone different from you offends you, what's the first place you're going to go? Are you going to assume that was a racial thing, or are you going to assume that it's a class thing, or you assume it might have been a gender thing, or what? So I think what's helpful to be able to put on each of these lenses. So I can put on a racial lens. I've been growing up in the black community and coming through black churches, I've been able to put on a racial lens fairly well, and I feel like I've grown a lot in the class lens. So it's helpful to be able to put on these different lenses. So part of what I'm trying to do here is to say, here's what this lens looks like in terms of a class lens. And another way of thinking about that is, if you think of, what category are you in this chart here? And I realize this is an all-inclusive chart. There's Native Americans, there's others, but for lack of space, I put white, black, Latino, and Asian, and then male and female, and then with that, different class groups. And there's a lot of ways you could break up class. You could break it up lower, middle, upper, or you could, well, there's only 30 minutes remaining already. Wow, that's amazing. Okay. Lower, middle, upper, or you could break it up into, often I'll look at it in terms of dominant class or non-dominant class. And often I would say the dominant is at least the middle class and the upper class. Sometimes lower middle might identify more with the lower classes. But the question is, in terms of the gospel, I feel like what we're called to do, and I think commonly held value, is that Jesus identified with the least of these. He identified to address oppression. So I believe that we're called to address oppression across all of these factors. So wherever you are here, I feel like part of what we're called to do is address oppression, whether it be across gender, race, or class. And what that does is it makes some people who may not be used to thinking about, I'm middle class, person of color or whatever. How do I think about someone who's from a poor white background? They're dealing with some class stuff, and then you start to get different dynamics that all of a sudden become very complicated. So with that, I want to talk about white urban poverty, and part of the reason for that is class becomes most apparent whenever you're looking at white urban poverty. And as a white male, I know whenever I'm dealing with oppression, I'm not dealing with it in terms of sexism, or I'm not dealing with it in terms of racism. I'm dealing with it in terms of classism. So for me, growing up, a lot of people have been surprised whenever I tell stories about, we were little hoodlums-looking kids, and we'd go into stores, and people would follow us around the stores, like a lot of, my black friends have talked about whenever they walk into stores. Or the other thing that I found interesting is, whenever people talked about racial profiling and pulling over people, I had no problem understanding that, because whenever we had long hair in high school, we used to get pulled over all the time, and they would see if we had drugs or other things. And now that I got my hair's a little shorter, or quite a bit shorter, but once I got my hair cut, I was like, wow, you don't get pulled over all the time, and there's some things along those lines. But that's a very minor aspect of that. But I want to talk a little bit about white urban poverty, and this is a graph that shows the proportion of urban poverty, and this is looking at suburbs and looking at cities. And what a lot of people don't realize is, people realize there's a lot of white people in the country, but because there's so many white people in the country, even though the poverty rates for white people is low, there is a very significant number of white people who are in cities who are poor. Now, it's important to understand all the aspects of this, but before we get into too much discussion, so 63% of people in cities or suburbs are actually white in the U.S. Another kind of myth that's out there is that white poverty is only rural, and if you actually look at rural poverty, it's actually more non-white than urban poverty is. So you actually have a larger proportion of black rural poverty and Hispanic rural poverty. And part of what these stereotypes do is I think it hurts everyone, because if the face, and a lot of the reason for this, I think it has to do with political, where people want to put the face of poverty as being someone who's, the black or Latino single mom or something like that, because if you put a white face up there, then, it might actually get more empathy from people across different political parties. And I think that a lot of times what it does is it perpetuates stereotypes. So the point of this isn't to devalue any different group, but the importance is to understand kind of what is really out there. And one thing that's important in understanding white poverty, there is a very significant difference in poverty rates, and that's very, very important. This is often the stat that you'll see, is that the black and Latino poverty rate is more than twice the white poverty rate. The Asian poverty rate is actually higher than the white poverty rate, and that's significant. But part of what's important is to understand that there are a lot of poor white people in cities, and there's a question of where are they? A lot of people don't know. Why is white poverty invisible? One of the reasons why it's invisible is white poverty, unlike other poverty, it isn't as geographically concentrated. It's much easier for a white person to sneak into a middle-class neighborhood and no one actually knows that they're poor white. If they, say there's a neighborhood that has a duplex that has low rent in a middle-class neighborhood, then they can go there, and all of a sudden you don't have the racism that other groups might deal with. So because of that, there's much more concentrated poverty in the black community and the Latino community. So what this is looking at what's the poverty concentration. Is there a high concentration of poverty in where people are living? And this is really significant in whenever you look at injustice, because the amount of injustice a community is experiencing, as you get higher poverty concentration, it becomes much, much more significant. So all those factors are important in understanding white poverty. That white poverty, it makes up the majority of urban poverty. The rural stereotypes are wrong. The difference in poverty rates are significant. And the effects of poverty are, the difference and poverty concentrations are significant. And one other thing I was going to say is of why urban white poverty really doesn't get that much recognition. A lot of it has to do with politics, and that other groups that are dealing with poverty, whether it's people of color in urban communities, they often will get identification from middle class, blacks or upper class blacks who will identify and kind of raise up the issues of the lower classes. And that also happens in rural communities, because poor whites, often they'll be in districts with congressmen and they want to get federal dollars, so the congressmen will make awareness of the rural white poverty. But what happens is people, poor white folks like what I grew up as, they don't really have a strong political base to get really people to be aware of the white poverty that's out there. So I think you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question, but what do you mean by poverty rate?
Okay, so this is, in poverty rate is, the U.S. Census has a way of categorizing poverty. So the question was, what do you mean by poverty rates? The U.S. Census has a way of categorizing poverty. And here I recognize I'm only looking at one aspect of class, but it's looking at income according to U.S. Census standards. So, does that answer your question? Are there other questions that people have in this? Is this kind of some surprising stats? Whenever I saw these stats, I was pretty surprised. And part of what was interesting for me is I go to the Salvation Army and I go to AGRM, and I see a lot of people working in white poverty in those communities. And I think that they understand some of the approaches that are needed. And in different communities, you need different approaches. And I think that it would be good to get all these different groups, CCCA, Salvation Army, AGRM, all together to learn from each other, because I think that both Salvation Army, people from the Salvation Army and CCDA have said that they would be eager to learn more about racial reconciliation from CCDA, and I think that there's things to be learned all the way around with that. So, any other questions on this? One thing I just want to talk about is, what the feeling of white poverty is. So I can talk about this some from my own personal background, but a lot of the feeling of being in white poverty, it's having feelings of anger and pain that has no identifiable source. So if you look at poor white music, the two main genres of poor white music, heavy metal and punk, almost all the lyrics, and it's just nonstop lyrics about anger and pain with no identifiable source. I remember in high school, I was big into the Metallica and all the death metal people, but that's all it's about. It's about pain, anger, and sometimes numbness, and it's just raging, but there's no target for that. And I think a part of the reason for that is because classism isn't actually viewed in society. So if you look at a lot of hip-hop music, there might be anger directed towards racism or things like that, but in poor white music there isn't so much awareness of that. And I think that that's important to understand. There's a lot of people here at CCDA that have really dug into the lyrics of hip-hop and look at what's the story that's really being said there. And I think it's important to do that in the poor white community. Also, what's unfortunate is often because people don't understand that there's oppression happening across classism, the anger can get displaced across race and racially, and often that's what happens. And I think that's something that's incredibly unfortunate. But I feel like as people become more aware of classism, then this will happen less, because people will understand there's actually systems that are causing the pain that's there. So any questions on that before I move on? Okay, so the next section I'm going to talk about classism. There's a lot of material here. I'm probably not going to be able to get through all of it. So someone had asked the question about what is kind of the evil aspects, and this is kind of what we're getting at in the evil aspects around class. And looking at first, what we need to do is uncover where is their classism. So whenever we're talking about classism, we're talking about it culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, interpersonally, and religiously. And part of what we're talking about, whenever you talk about oppression, you're talking about in terms of an imbalance of institutionalized power. That's something that's important to recognize. It isn't just interpersonal oppression. That I wouldn't say is oppression. You have to have an imbalance of institutionalized power. And another thing that is really important to think about is to think about the different ways that oppression and classism and racism can happen. And this actually is building on some of the teachings that Carl Ellis has done. So some of you may have seen something that looks similar to this, but there's multiple ways you can think about oppression. You can think about it in individual terms or collective terms, like how a group might oppress someone. Or you can think about it being intentional, like I'm trying to be racist or something that's unintentional. So some of the different examples in this quadrant one, the individual intentional. That's what people often, racism, classism, whatever, it gets simplified into only this area where people define it as individual acts of meanness, essentially. And there you're talking about lynchings, you're talking about things across class, like growing up I got beat up because of wearing poor clothes, like I dressed like I was poor, I got beat up. And I think that that is what I would say was intentional. They're trying to beat me up. They may not have been aware that they're beating me up because I was poor, but that's what was happening. The unintentional it would be like offending someone, racially, is the racial example. A class example, say it could be doing the same thing across class. Someone who might make fun of the way I dress or the way I talk or what I eat or whatever, where they're kind of unintentionally insulting kind of a part of who I am. The other part, the collective intentional. So on the racial example, the best example is just legal segregation, where you had Jim Crow laws, where it was intentionally one group trying to exercise power over another group. In class terms, I would say a good example of this is keeping minimum wage low. Minimum wage now, if I remember right, and don't quote me on this, I think it's about 60 to 70% of what it was in the 1970s. So I see the effects that has. My brother, who he works at a minimum wage job, he recently lost his house, and he had been working at the same job for 15 years, and it just got so run down because even though he's getting paid the same wage, inflation's gone up, and the same wage isn't able to pay the bills, and that affects people. So I think that's a very significant form of collective intentional. So this is where a group is intentionally keeping minimum wage low to maximize profits. Another collective unintentional example, it might be where a group exercises some form of oppression to another group. So one of my black friends, he said, the best example he had of that was flesh-colored Band-Aids. You can only get flesh-colored Band-Aids to match one color flesh, and you can guess what type of flesh that typically is. So that's an example, but there's hundreds of things like that. The fact that you have all the TV shows on TV are white people, and all the, everything is kind of geared around a common culture. If you want to get a perspective of what it would look like if things were turned, this isn't a great movie, but I thought it was just interesting to see some of the examples of what would it look like if the world was reversed. There's a movie called White Man's Burden. Has anyone here seen that? It's not a great movie, but I thought it was interesting for white people just to imagine what it would be like if the world were completely reversed. Then it starts to make you how significant those type of things would be. I would say that a collective unintentional example in churches might be a church that its culture just inherently is so elitist that it makes it really hard for anyone who's coming from a low-income background to be able to make it in that church. So that would be a collective unintentional. So if you look at the basis for dealing with classism, there's, we could do a whole long study. We could have the whole talk be on this. But James very clearly talks about, suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man with fine clothes and say, here's your good seat for you, say to the poor man, you stand there, sit on the floor by my feet. Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Now, basically, I think most of us here can agree that the Bible prohibits discriminating on people based on their income. I think that's a pretty clear-cut case. But whenever classism enters the church, that's actually what happens. And if you take this big picture view of classism, there's all these aspects of classism. It's just not the intentional aspects of classism. Then you start to gain a greater understanding of where is classism in the church. And the gentleman who asked about, how do we deal with class reconciliation? A part of it is recognizing what are the systems, what are the things that are at play, and then once we understand what the issues are, then we can start to think about how do we play a role to address those. So one of the most significant aspects of classism in the church is cultural. Consumerism, so one example is if the consumerism of members becomes a class barrier. So, you know, if everyone's wearing the latest, you know, $60 jeans or something, and if you feel like you don't have those things, you feel out of place, that can be an issue. I know a lot of churches, they'll go out for lunch afterwards, and often, you know, in well-to-do churches, they'll go out to lunch where it costs $20 a plate or something like that. All of a sudden, you're socially excluding people from social circles without even really thinking about it. Other things that happen is class assimilation, and the way I would define that, so assimilation, what that is where one cultural group tries to take someone from another culture and to get them to accept their cultural norms. So if you're taking someone from a lower class cultural background, and all of a sudden you're saying, now you need to accept all these new cultural norms, that's essentially, you know, what the early missionaries did of, you know, going into Africa and saying, okay, you got to wear this tie, and you got to, you know, change how you're dressed, and you got to change how you speak English, because that's, you know, God's language, that's what they speak in heaven and all that. So, and I think we would agree that that's probably not a helpful thing, and that happens across class also. And one of the most significant ways that happens is you have these upper or middle class centric values. It's kind of, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics on this. And let me just put a disclaimer before I talk about some of these opposing contrasting class values. It's kind of dangerous using generalizations across class values. And one thing I would say is that it's helpful to understand these generalizations in terms of if you're trying to identify when a conflict with someone might have a class cultural element to it. Where it's not helpful is to say someone's lower class, therefore they're going to be this way. You can't apply the generalizations to people. But I think it's helpful to understand what are some of the aspects of class as culture. So this next slide talks about some of the aspects of class as culture. And I have this slide divided into the dominant class values and the non-dominant class values. And the dominant class, I would say, is middle class and above. Non-dominant might be lower middle class and below. But the items I have underlined are the ones that I've seen in urban ministry all the time, where you'll see class conflict, and sometimes this can be racial conflict too. But you'll see class conflict. So one of the most significant things I've seen is there's some people who they just like things to be structured, orderly, they like things to be planned. There are other people who they like things to be spontaneous, and they'll perform well in a spontaneous environment. Whenever those two are at tension, and they often are, how do you deal with that tension? Do you recognize that that's a class tension, or do you just say, oh, the right way is this way? And I think that's important across all of these. You know, another thing is just how intense and how reserved are people. So, you know, going into an after-school program, and I've seen so many volunteers go into after-school programs where they see this after-school program. It's not structured or orderly. It's kind of spontaneous, a little bit chaotic. It's very intense. You got kids screaming and other things, and someone's coming, and they're coming from this background where they're reserved, they want structure and order, and they don't understand that they've just stepped into a different culture. You know, if someone went to Africa, I think that they would understand that they're stepping into a different cultural environment. But I think whenever you go into a different class environment, whether it's, you know, white, black, Latino, Asian, whatever group, often that you're stepping into a different cultural group, and it's important to recognize that. Another major issue is attitudes towards authority. A lot of dominant class, you know, now the big trend in management is egalitarian. You know, we're all supposed to be at the same level. And but most urban churches, you know, I grew up in black churches, and black churches, you respect authority, you know, and you just, that's what you do. And I think that that's true across, you know, white lower class churches. Authority is taken very seriously in other lower class churches. Another thing is patience versus efficiency. You know, I've seen a lot of volunteers, if they stand around for 20 minutes and not do anything, they're about ready to pull their hair out because they want things to be efficient. They don't recognize that this is some of the cultural tensions that are happening. Another is that trauma is common versus trauma is avoided. Some of you who work with youth, I imagine you encounter trauma every now and then in your programs, and you know the trauma will sometimes spill over to other people. And, you know, if your volunteer is experiencing this trauma, you know, like someone gets shot out in front of the place, or, you know, something else, how do they respond to that? Do they respond with this attitude that trauma is common and we just need to deal with that the best we can, or do we say, trauma's avoided, I'm moving back out to the suburbs because there's trauma? So these are some of the different class values. I could go on and talk about a lot of the other ones. The subjective, objective is a very big one. This is really big among funders, where all my funders care about, especially government grants, they want to know the numbers. They want to know the number of kids, they want to know the grades. They don't, I mean, unfortunately, I feel like what's more important is more the subjective view of, is this person's life being changed? You know what I'm saying? But you don't have metrics where you can say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did your children's life get changed? And everyone's, of course, if you're going to report on government grant, going to say 10 on everything, But that's what people who are doing youth ministry really care about. They care about the subjective. Another big difference is the honesty and directness. Like if I'm mad at someone, generally I'm going to tell them. But other cultural backgrounds, politeness and tact is much more important. So those are some of the contrasting class values. So whenever you try to take one set of values and impose it on another set, especially whenever it's coming from the dominant group, that can be classism. Some of the other things, I'm going to go through some of these fairly quickly. Social, isolation from social capital across class and racial segregation. Who here has read the book Divided by Faith? Are there a lot of people here have read Divided by Faith? One way I would characterize that book in terms of class is basically the argument is saying, and this is a book that looks at this issue that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week, and it looks at what's the effect of that. And part of the argument that they're making is because of the people who are going to these lower class churches or churches that may not have access to the resources, and because of the effects of racism, the end result is that all the people who have access to social capital, who have access to jobs, who have access, I do technology, who have computer skills, who have computers, who have all these resources, they're sitting in their own churches, and the people who know how to work with the community, who have the skills with community resources, they're sitting in their own churches. And the two groups aren't getting together, and they aren't exchanging, they aren't reconciling. I think some of the other things I've seen, excluding from social groups and close friendships based on class, I remember going to white churches and never understanding why I didn't fit in there until I started to understand class, and then I realized, oh, I'm from a different class background from people, and that's a part of what's at play. Another huge aspect is programmatic. So, today we don't have the front row pew. Now, no one wants to sit on the front row pew, so that's not the issue of are we discriminating. It's the programs in the church. Whose needs are the programs focused on in the church? And I think that's where you really get into assessing, what are churches doing? So are the programs only focusing on middle and upper class needs? Are you only selecting leadership from middle and upper class? Or do you even have a leadership development model that is requiring that people can quickly become leaders? Part of what I've realized, even from my own journey, it's taken me a long time from the time I decided to do urban ministry to the time I could work through a lot of my stuff to be able to lead an urban ministry, and I think that's because of the trauma that I went through. I think that's fairly common for a lot of people. And one of the ways to characterize that, and I'll get your question in a second. One of the ways to characterize that, if you think of this is something that a psychologist designs called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and basically the idea behind it is that there's different needs and there's an order to them. If you're about ready to thirst to death, you really aren't so concerned about your ego, or you aren't concerned about your, what am I going to do Friday night? You want to get some water. And basically the idea is that needs often have a hierarchy. And part of what's important to recognize is that in that hierarchy, there's lower class needs and there's middle and upper class needs. And the lower class needs, and this is where a lot of urban ministries are often focused on physical survival needs, water, food, sleep, warmth. So a lot of homeless shelters and soup kitchens and food pantries are focused on these levels. A lot of after-school programs are focused on the safety and security, physical safety, getting kids off the street, economic security, jobs programs, freedom from threats. And then a lot of youth programs are also focused on social needs, acceptance, being a part of a group. Those are the lower class needs. Part of what is a challenge is whenever people start to say that these needs up here, the ego, leadership development, or the question of if I had unlimited resources, what would I do? That's a self-actualization question. And once you start to think about, if you start to say that these needs up here are the spiritual needs, and these are the physical needs, then all of a sudden that is kind of a classist way of viewing the world. And a lot of churches will take that approach. They say, no, we want to focus on the spiritual needs, and this is, it's up to people to figure that stuff out themselves. But if you're in a low-income community where this is the primary needs of physical safety, economic security, then where are your programs serving? And where are the programs of different churches serving? And whenever the majority of churches' resources are going towards this, that affects the overall body of Christ. Does that make sense? You had a question?
Yeah, in regards to, you talk about people being in survival mode, and you talk about, education, computers, technology, things of that nature. How do you bridge those gaps and where that you're going to bring a lot of those resources to lower-income families that are in survival mode, and they don't necessarily see a need for it, care about it, whatever, and like, well, this is the way the world's going, this is where the money's at. I mean, you can't force people to see that particular view, and you don't want to force them. You want to have it available to them, but how do you like bridge that gap and say, here it is.
Right.
It's kind of it should be important to you a little bit anyway.
Okay, so let me try to rephrase the question. The question is, for people who are dealing with basic survival needs, how do you get them to bridge the gap? Maybe to think more long-term, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
I think that that's a major issue. I think part of it is just, and I don't know the answer. I mean, we could talk about this for 2 hours, and there's a lot of people who get this. So, but I think a lot of it is just recognizing you got to start with where people are at. And if someone's hungry, you feed them first, and then you get them the job program. If they don't have a place to stay, you get them a place to stay, then you get them the job program. So I think starting with where people are at and understanding that often cultures are, the reason why they're that way is because that is the way that's important. Part of what I realized, I grew up in the inner city. I'm a very kind of spontaneous type person. The reason why I'm spontaneous is because if anytime I'm walking down the street, I'm going to have to run because someone's chasing me, I learned to be pretty creative. I'm up for whatever's going to happen because that's what it was like growing up. And I think that sometimes the environment affects culture too. So the next part I was going to talk about, often teaching and preaching will focus on middle and upper class needs. Another important thing is just to recognize that the whole Christian publishing industry, the Christian media industry, can you think of any groups that are focused on lower classes? There will be groups that will be focused on the black community or Latino community or things like that, but really coming from a lower class perspective, it's almost non-existent. And part of the reason for that is it's just economics, to where people will sell what makes money, and they sell things to the middle class. But part of the problem is that you don't get the messages out. You aren't getting the messages of the lower class community out that widely. We have to come to places like CCCA to get these messages because there aren't radio stations that will, share all these talks everywhere. So that's a significant example. Distorted biblical perspective in dominant culture, downplaying the Old Testament, prophetic books, teaching on justice. There's a lot of churches that will say, here's the part of the Bible we care about, and it's whatever part that fits their needs. So I think that another important part of that is, and I want to talk about this more, and I think this is a major thing that I would like to talk about as a larger group in CCDA. There's biblical teachings. Who here has heard a sermon about tithe? I'm sure anyone who's gone to church has probably heard a sermon about tithe. Who here has ever heard a sermon about how the pastor is supposed to handle the tithe? One person. So that's interesting. That's fairly rare, and I think that it's important to recognize that. I'm going to jump to that real quick because there are teachings in the Bible about how to handle the tithe. There's both New Testament and Old Testament teachings that handle the tithe, but the basis for most of our tithing comes from the Old Testament. And if you look at what the Old Testament said, there's actually a couple passages that talk about this. But Deuteronomy 14, 28 through 29. Basically, this is the part where it talks about tithing, what you're supposed to do with the tithe. And what it says, at the end of every 3 years, you're supposed to take all the tithes from that year's produce and store it in the towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment of their own, this is Levites who can't raise their own money because maybe they don't have enough people in their town, the aliens, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your town may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So basically, whenever you look at the passages of tithing, it says you're supposed to give 10%, but then it says every 3 years, or 1/3 of the tithe is supposed to go towards the poor. So if you look at the global body of Christ, that's how things should be working in the global body of Christ. But the challenge is that isn't how things are working, There's a whole lot of problems that happen with that. And I don't want to oversimplify classism purely in terms of economics, but that's a major part of things. It looks like I'm running out of time, so let me just
So the next section is about understanding classism in the church. And a lot of what we've talked about up to now has been understanding what is classist culture. The last section was a lot about understanding classist culture. And the way a lot of those other sections work with this one is you almost have to do an overlay to understand, whenever we talk about what I mean is you could have this sin raging in your life and you wouldn't be called on it in a lot of middle and upper class churches because the whole church is engaged in this sin. If that makes sense. Kind of like slavery. If the whole church owns slaves, then what are you going to do? And but the whole church becomes compromised. So materialism and consumerism, I would say, is the biggest one, to where people don't get called on materialism and consumerism. Continued benefit from generational sins such as racism and continued exploitation. So any sort of way that we're benefiting from racism or classism, avoiding significant exposure to social problems. For some reason, it seems to be okay in our society for everyone to move to the suburbs and avoid social problems, but the result is that it's perpetuation of de facto segregation. And Newsweek recently did an article that said that we're more segregated now than before the civil rights movement. But the difference is that now it's what's called de facto segregation, where it's just people are choosing to be segregated, and a lot of the reason for that is classism. Class-centric values and culture. So the idea that you can impose your class-centric values on other people, that in itself is classism. And basically any other classism that's operating in the church, I would say the sin. If you aren't calling people on it, then that is being syncretistic. Does all that make sense?
So you're saying syncretistic because all these things are coming under the umbrella of positive Christian behavior?
Or people aren't called on it. It'd be like a church that has everyone is alcoholics, and it's just the pastor's an alcoholic, everyone's an alcoholic, and they just say, it's okay to be alcoholic, but look, everyone's an alcoholic. And what I'm saying is there are things like that, materialism, or other things that exist in our society where it's just acceptable. It may not be viewed as positive, but people aren't called on it. It may be a neutral thing, if that makes sense.
Because it seems like syncretism. So I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. I don't know. I guess my question is, because syncretism is like promoting something versus not.
I don't think so. I mean, we can look up the definition, but I don't think that's true.
Syncretism is actually the blending of two different belief systems. So like voodoo is a classic example of syncretism, where Catholicism and tribal African beliefs definitely mixed together. And so there have been cases on syncretism in the Western Church. But there is a difference between syncretism and mass compromise on the same.
I don't know. I mean, why don't we have a longer discussion on that? But my understanding, I guess the way I'm defining syncretism is that it is.
How are you defining it?
Okay, so the way I'm defining it is syncretism is mass compromise on sin.
Right.
So, okay. And I think the reason why I'm doing that is because our society's definition of syncretism, basically, if it's something that you put explicitly as religious, then that's syncretistic. But if it's something that's not explicitly religious, like, being an alcoholic, we aren't necessarily explicitly saying we worship the god of alcohol, but everyone in the church is worshiping the god of alcohol if they're an alcoholic. Does that make sense? So I think that it's getting at what's not the explicit religious, but yeah, it's more the implicit. Right. And what I'm saying is, in the same way that you go to a tribal culture and you take the values of that culture that may not be godly and then you allow them to permeate, non-godly values, I'm saying that that's happened in our society. that because we're in it, everyone's blind,
Right.
so we don't see those things, if that makes sense.
It would be helpful on the slide if you included some language on that.
Definition of syncretism.
Definition,
Okay.
yeah. Specifically saying something like
Can you get back
geographic
another-
syncretism.
Yeah,
You
okay.
know, because I feel like otherwise this is a little confusing for anybody who's just familiar with that, especially with things like Santeria and voodoo that are traditionally considered synchronistic.
Yeah, okay. Another area is economics. So a lot of these are just systemic. So disproportionate resources in upper class churches. So if you have upper and middle class churches where everyone has higher income and they're all tithing, then you're going to have disproportionate resources. So I think another implication of that is, and this is, kind of a widely discussed controversy within, is having individual focused funding schemes. It's a issue with, a lot of missions agencies where the funding is entirely individual focused because people who have high access to social capital, who have a lot of friends who are resourced, they're able to do the fundraising, so you create a funding bias. So I'm not saying anything new to people who've been probably very well aware of the issue. It's just a question of what is the cost to address that issue.
Yeah, life is the same cost.
Right. Another major issue I would say in classism in the church is that there's a very strong value of having relational support of missions, which what that ultimately comes down to is giving to missions that match the class or culture of the church. So you want to support, rather than directly supporting an indigenous ministry that may be bringing thousands of Christians every year to Jesus, you want to support someone from your culture who can relate to you in your terms, and they're going to go to this other place, and they may not be nearly as effective as someone who's an indigenous minister, but that becomes a bias in the process. And there's a lot of, upper class churches where they only want to support ministries to upper class. So we're going to go, we'll support this ministry to whatever upper class group. Another aspect of economics is cream skimming middle and upper class leadership from lower class churches. So what I would say is any church that tries to be racially diverse without being class diverse, that's what they're going to do. They're going to, without even trying, they're going to attract the middle and upper class leaders that are people of color into their church, and then what ends up happening is you have all these fairly wealthy leaders that go to the middle and upper class churches, and I think that's an issue. And I saw, I'm not going to go into the details, but I saw some of that happening at Dole whenever I was there, but there's also other issues going on at Dole, meaning that they were experiencing a lot of, whenever their leaders left, a lot of their more affluent leaders, they didn't go to lower class churches. A lot of them went to middle and upper class churches, and the end result was that you had systemic issue of classism happening in that, if that makes sense. So, and then you have issues like, while I was there, the heater broke, and you don't have money to fix the heater. What do? You know what I'm saying? It's a serious issue. And, granted, there's other things that are going on, but you have to understand what are the systemic issues. It's kind of the equivalent of, I would say, in the same way that you had the trend from urban communities to suburban communities, and you had a lot of loss of resources in the urban communities, I would say that same trend is somewhat happening between the neighborhood church and the mega church, to where the mega church in general is middle and upper class, and not always, but fairly often middle and upper class, and you're having the neighborhood church. People are migrating to the megachurch, but the challenge is that if the megachurch is more focused on middle and upper class needs, then all of a sudden you have a net loss of resources. So here's just a way the economics can work. So you take which I would say gives at least half of what its effort into lower income community. That could be because the people who go there are from a lower income community, or it could be because their programs are focused on the lower income community. And you take, so say, you have 10 people and they get $10,000 a year, and then half of that is basically going to the low income community before they left. Once they leave and they go into a church that's serving the middle class, then all of a sudden those resources are being directed to middle class needs. And the middle class church may feel like it's doing great because it's giving 10% to the lower income community, but the net loss is that, you lost 40% of the resources going to the lower income community. So that's happening en masse right now.
It's not just economic, it's also human.
Right, yeah.
Labor resources.
Right, and to a certain extent, I don't blame individuals making those choices, but in the same way with the suburbs, people have to understand what are the systemic issues. And if you don't look at the systemic issues for everyone moving into the suburbs, it's the same type of thing for people moving into megachurches, or middle-class megachurches. Because there are lower-class megachurches, but they're more rare. Institutional, so class-based standards for ministry or being a pastor. For example, a college degree, I would say that actually having that standard is a classist standard. If you look at most of the lower class denominations, they don't have that standard. Their standard is more, is God using you type of thing, like the Pentecostal denominations and things along those lines. And then there's also class-based denominational structures and rules that basically, unless you're middle class, then you aren't going to be able to make it in these denominational structures or rules, if that makes sense. So that could be leadership selection, it could be, a lot of different things that affect things. So, any questions on that, on the institutional?
I think something that's just important that needs to be said. You said it, but it needs to be said that classism isn't always intentional.
Right, absolutely.
Just like racism isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Classism isn't always intentional. And I think I'm moving in with the assumption, people definitely recognize that.
I wouldn't want that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I think the difference between bigotry and racism is a huge concept. From bigotry being intentional.
Yeah.
And that actually can work both ways. Blacks can be bigoted toward whites.
Right. Yeah.
There's the classic definition of whites can be racist toward whites in the country within a minority.
Right.
It's a little strong, but it's basically saying classism is effective oppression of the dominant group.
Right.
Whether intentional or whether by default by the way the systems tend to work.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on how you're defining those terms.
I know.
Right.
I agree. That's the definitions of it.
Yeah, I would say if there's someone who's upper class and they get beat up because they're in a lower class community, they're experiencing classism, but they aren't experiencing so much systemic classism. They're experiencing...
that's why I use the word bigotry.
Yeah. So, right, I hear you. Most people are kind of aware of those distinctions here. Another area of classism, so distorted biblical perspective, so having a perspective that's individualistic, resulting in either being apolitical or in kind of a blaming the victims politics. So if you take an individualistic perspective, then everyone deserves what they get, kind of is the attitude on the individualistic perspective, rather than, realizing that there are systems at play.
Can you say more about that in terms of scripture?
Basically emphasizing the individualistic passages and de-emphasizing the corporate passages is, I think, what I'm getting at. Okay. And to a certain extent, that can be emphasizing the New Testament over the Old Testament, because the Old Testament has a lot of corporate stuff in it. So, and even taking an attitude that the New Testament completely replaces the Old Testament, and the New Testament is like the new law. Like I've seen a lot of churches that kind of present the New Testament that way.
Version 2.
Right, yeah. There's the Old Law, which is Old Testament, and then now there's the New Law, which is the New Testament. And then you try to figure out your legalism to justify, whatever you're trying to prove. So, another is just ignoring the role of the body of Christ as reconciling agent in the world. So if you look at the body of Christ and you take these issues, these systemic issues like, the de facto segregation or people moving out in the suburbs, if people took the corporate view, then you would think that people would say, actually, no, we need to move corporately, have thousands of people move into the city, not just a few. And do the same type of thing globally to, if the U.S. has, the majority of the world's wealth, what are we doing to help people in other countries and redistribute resources? So in terms of actually looking at the Bible, I would say in general, it's downplaying the Old Testament, downplaying the prophetic books, and downplaying teachings on justice. So there's a lot of different ministries, and they'll even be explicit in their teaching, like, we value this part of the Bible. We value only the Gospels, and then the Old Testament we don't teach from, and maybe we'll use Paul sometimes. Or they don't exactly say that, but if you actually go through their discipleship program, that's a part of what they'll teach. They'll say, you should only use this portion of the Bible, or almost always use this portion of the Bible. And the problem with that is, you're being selective. You know what I'm saying? And it's not just, are you only using that portion? It's what percentage are you using? Are you 99% of the time pulling from certain areas, if that makes sense?
Do a couple conclusions with this, and I'd love to talk with people more about this, and I'm going to make this available on our website. But in terms of churches, I think that there's three approaches churches can take towards dealing with class reconciliation. To be a lower class dominant church where lower class folks and lower class values are actually the dominant values of your church. And there's a lot of lower class dominant churches, I'd say, Kojic, Assemblies of God, often a lot of the different Pentecostal denominations, Salvation Army, I think you could define that way. There's a lot of lower class dominant churches. The other is to be a multi-class church. Part of what's difficult in that, because of natural tendencies, it's really hard to do because people who have the resources often will quickly dominate in that. And the only way I believe that can happen is if you have a strong pastor that can make sure, or pastors, that will help offset the natural tendencies. The other thing is you have to get a critical mass. If you have, 1,000 people who are middle and upper class and you have 15 people who are lower income, you aren't going to be able to do this because you have to get a critical mass of people that you can create a culture where there's an even sharing. And the other option, I think this is for a lot of suburban churches, what people really need to think about, is to be a middle and upper class giving church. And there, what I would argue is that all churches that aren't one of these two should be thinking about giving 1/3 of their tithe to lower class dominant churches, to parachurches, to urban ministries. The other thing that I would say, and this is getting into the reconciliation, I can give a whole other talk about the aspects of reconciliation. So some of it's dealing with systemic stuff in the body of Christ. Some of it I feel like is a personal process of class identity. So, for your class background, understanding your unique background and what your purpose is in dealing with systems of classism. For class access, it's to help people be upwardly mobile. For class identification, it's to be downwardly mobile. And for class consciousness, it's to help everyone grow in class consciousness. And I think that that's kind of the overall vision for thinking about class reconciliation. So hopefully people found that helpful, and I would love to stay and talk with people. Did everyone get the sign-up sheet that went around? Hopefully. If you didn't get the sign-up sheet, where are the sign-up sheets? Did someone raise their hands who has the sign-up sheets? Okay, we got the sign-up sheets in the back. If you could sign up for that, if you want to be a part of an ongoing dialogue about class, I would love to continue that dialogue, follow up with you by email or phone, and love to talk with anyone else who has a particular interest in this area. So.